It is an issue that has been hotly debated for decades, if not longer. In 1837, Colonel Richard William Howard Vyse, with the help of some gunpowder archaeology, blasted his way into some hitherto secret chambers above the King's Chamber in the Great Pyramid, and found therein numerous painted quarry markings, the only writing ever discovered inside the monument. Among those unofficial quarry markings, graffiti, Vyse and his team found a number of cartouches bearing the name of Khnum Khufu. In the topmost, Campbell's chamber, they found the cartouche of Khufu, abbreviation of Khnum Khufu, the king who, according to mainstream Egyptology, built the Great Pyramid circa 2550 BC. They also discovered Khufu's so-called Horus name, Mededu. In 1837, no one even knew that such a thing existed. These markings provided Egyptologists with the only tangible pieces of hard evidence directly connecting Khufu to the Great Pyramid. Curiously though, the lowest of these chambers, discovered some 72 years earlier by Nathaniel Davison, was completely devoid of any such markings. This strange situation led some to speculate that perhaps Vyse's discovery was not so much a discovery at all, but rather a fraud perpetrated by Vyse himself. In 1837 there was no scientific means to analyse the paint used to create these marks, and so Egyptology had to accept Vyse's discovery on faith, on his word. The question was, is Vyse a man who could be trusted? In 1807, Vyse stood as a candidate in the Beverley constituency for the British Parliament. After Vyse won the seat by a margin not seen before or since, Mr. Philip Staple, who came a very poor third, presented a petition to Parliament charging Vyse of electoral fraud. A petition of Philip Staple, Esquire, was read, setting forth that at the late election for members to serve in Parliament for the borough of Beverley in the county of York, John Wharton, Esquire, Richard William Howard Vyse, Esquire, and the petitioner were candidates to represent the said borough, and that the said John Wharton and Richard William Howard Vyse, each of them was guilty of bribery and corruption and corrupt practices in order to their being elected to serve as members for the said borough in the present Parliament. Vyse makes no mention as to the precise nature of the allegations being made against him. Who was behind these charges, and what evidence did they have? While Vyse's published work remains silent on these key questions, what this episode demonstrates is that someone believed that the activities of Vyse in Egypt were improper, and this person threatened via the UK press to expose what he was doing, thus once again bringing the moral character of Vyse into doubt. The questionable discoveries of Vyse would not be complete without making mention of the claimed discovery by him and his team of the remains of Mycerinus in the smallest of the main pyramids at GIZA, a discovery that was later found to be completely bogus. In this regard, renowned and respected British Egyptologist Sir Edward writes, "In the original burial chamber, Colonel Vyse had discovered some human bones and the lid of a wooden anthropoid coffin inscribed with the name of Mycerinus. This lid, which is now in the British Museum, cannot have been made in the time of Mycerinus, for it is of a pattern not used before the Sate period. Radiocarbon tests have shown that the bones date from early Christian times." So, what we have here are archaeological artifacts from two quite different periods that have somehow magically found themselves together in Menkaur's pyramid, having been recovered by Vyse and his team only after other earlier explorers of this pyramid had previously somehow managed to overlook them. Why were the bones and coffin not of the same period? Are we to believe that there were two intrusive burials from two different periods? Why then weren't fragments of coffin or bones uncovered from the other intrusive burial, assuming there were two such burials? Do these events alone not reek of an attempt at deception by Weiss and/or his team, trying to pass off a discovery that was later found to be false? If we have grounds here in Menkaur's pyramid to suspect attempted deception, we have to ask, just how does this impinge upon the credibility of Weiss and his claimed discoveries elsewhere at Giza, including the inscriptions he allegedly discovered in the Great Pyramid? If all of this isn't bad enough for Weiss's reputation, then the 1954 handwritten family history of a Mr. Walter M. Allen of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, makes it a whole lot worse. Walter Allen's great-grandfather, Humphrey Brewer, apparently worked with Weiss and his team at Giza in 1837 and witnessed Weiss's assistants, Mr. Hill and Mr. Raven, refreshing old paint and making new markings. He wrote as follows: Humphrey received a prize for the bridge he designed in Vienna over Danube. He went to Egypt 1837, British Medical Service to Egypt. They were to build hospital in Cairo for Arabs with severe eye afflictions. Dr. Naylor took Humphrey along. Treatment not successful, hospital not built. He joined a Colonel Weiss exploring Giza pyramids. Rechecked dimensions 2 pyramids. Had dispute with Raven and Hill about painted marks in pyramid. Faint marks were repainted, some were new. Did not find 2. Had words with a Mr. Hill and Weiss when he left. Curiously, while Weiss makes no mention of Humphrey Brewer in his published book, he does refer to all the other individuals mentioned in Walter Allen's account, including Dr. Naylor, with his intention to help the local Arab people with severe eye problems. And as we see from the Allen account, it seems that his great-grandfather had a dispute with Weiss before leaving. Had Brewer objected to the marks being painted, accusing Weiss of perpetrating fraud, then it is hardly likely that a young man barely 20 years old, and of little consequence to Weiss, would have been mentioned in Weiss's finished work. That said, however, even though Weiss may not have mentioned Brewer by name, he may have indicated his presence at the site through the work which he did for Weiss in the Great Pyramid. This is precisely the kind of work in which Brewer would have been involved in. However, the most damning evidence of all comes from Weiss's own hand, and it shows beyond reasonable doubt that he did perpetrate a deception within the Great Pyramid. It seems that, in the absence of official scientific tests having been done on these painted markings, the only avenue left to explore would be Weiss's handwritten journal. Weiss's handwritten journal consists of around 600 pages of yellowing, folded foolscap pages, bound together with a thin white ribbon, and all contained within a rather unremarkable card folder. Although some pages are perfectly clear, the ink on many of the pages is exceedingly faint, browning with age. What posed the biggest problem for us, however, was Weiss's handwriting. It is sorely difficult, if not entirely impossible, to read any of it. We came across something that shocked them. In fact, they looked at each other in stunned silence as the realization and enormity of what we were looking at sank in. They were observing compelling evidence that the cartouche of Khufu, which Weiss claimed to have discovered within the Great Pyramid, must indeed have been forged by him, as a number of people over the years have long suspected. Here they were, barely able to read a few words of Weiss's scrawling handwriting, and yet the ancient Egyptian script he had so carefully copied into his journal revealed to us the truth of the disputed inscriptions in the Great Pyramid that many have been seeking for decades, if not longer. On the surface, these two cartouches, with the oval shapes to the right of the hieroglyphs in figures 2 and 3, appear unremarkable. When we look a little closer, however, the simple truth they hold reveals itself. The cartouche in figure 2 is a copy of the cartouche that Weiss claims he found in the Great Pyramid, the cartouche we find in the monument today. The second cartouche, figure 3, which Weiss also found, is presented only in his handwritten journal. He didn't publish this drawing, and clearly it was found somewhere else, since it is slightly different to the cartouche in the Great Pyramid. Had the cartouche in figure 3 been copied from the cartouche in Campbell's chamber, then Weiss most surely would have copied the small lines into the plain circle that we observe in the circle of figure 2. That he did not copy these lines tells us that he did not observe such lines in the circle of this cartouche in figure 3, which implies, of course, that this cartouche in figure 3 is from a different source to that in Campbell's chamber, figure 2. Now, if we look below the small snake hieroglyph, between the two quail-chick glyphs of both cartouches, we can observe two small dots side by side, and here's the point. These two dots are a mistake. They are not part of the king's name, and they are likely the result of random splashes of paint dropping accidentally from the scribe's paintbrush. Indeed, even in his book, published 3 years after he was in Egypt, Weiss presumably, having now learned this fact for himself, removed this mistake from the Khufu cartouche that he supposedly found in the Great Pyramid. The question that must now be asked here, of course, is how is it possible that an identical random mistake can be found in two cartouches of Khufu from two seemingly different sources? If we reject such an outcome as being beyond the realms of probability, then what we have here is compelling evidence that one cartouche was copied from the other. In short, the cartouche we observe today in Campbell's chamber was copied from an original external source by Weiss. If we take the view that sufficient doubts exist on the character of Weiss, and that there is now also sufficient evidence that casts doubt on his claimed discovery, how does this have an impact on Egyptology, and where then does Egyptology go from here? The answer is simple. Egyptology must do what it should have done in the first place with these inscriptions: consider them inadmissible until proper science can verify them. Egyptology must put aside all written testimonies made concerning the markings in these chambers and return to the actual physical evidence itself. It must apply hard science to try to determine the authenticity of these inscriptions, for only then might the truth of these markings finally be settled. It just needs to be added that it is not for this writer or anyone else to disprove the authenticity of the inscriptions within these chambers. It is the responsibility of Egyptology to take these issues seriously and to prove scientifically that these inscriptions are authentic, rather than to accept dutifully the word of a man whose actions have brought a number of others to question his moral character. Refusing to conduct proper science on these inscriptions is simply no longer a tenable position. The world deserves to know the truth about these inscriptions. What do you think? Let us know your thoughts in the comments.